Welcome to Module 20 of Interpersonal Communication, the Dissolution of Romantic Relationships. There's so much going on in this portion of this course that we're going to split this module into two videos, and this is the first of them. You'll recall that earlier we talked about Mark Knapp's research, which found that romantic relationships tend to unfold over the course of several stages. And we talked about those coming together or integration stages. Those were initiation and experimentation, intensification, integrating, and then bonding. Now the time has come to talk about the four stages in the disintegration process. And as I said, we'll tackle the first of those two in this video, and the first of two in the 20th module. Well, Mark Knapp's research has been replicated by many researchers in different contexts, and so we're fairly certain that what we're about to share represents the universality in that universality versus idiosyncrasy spectrum. We've used Romeo and Juliet as an example of romantic relationships, and we'll continue that here. Like most romantic relationships, Romeo and Juliet's relationship has had its ups and downs, but now something is different. It seems as if Romeo has begun to transition into the first of what are called the dissolution stages, or the disintegration stages in romantic relationships. The first stage is called differentiation, and the key to understanding the differentiation stage is to realize that this is when people begin to see differences between themselves and the other person in the romantic relationship. And fundamentally what's happening is people begin to notice and to focus on those differences more than they used to. And those differences begin to drive a wedge between the people involved in the romantic relationship. Now, it's quite common for romantic couples to fall into the differentiation stage. It's even more common for one of the two people in the relationship to fall into the differentiation stage. Should one fall into the differentiation stage, it's not necessarily that big of a deal. The problem becomes when people spend extended periods of time in the differentiation stage. The problem comes when people end up going in and out of the differentiation stage on a regular basis. And the problem comes when people make choices in the differentiation stage to do things that harm the underlying fabric of that relationship. And so communicatively, a lot is going on in this differentiation stage. However, most of it takes place intrapersonally. That is to say, most of it takes place inside people's heads. And so often people feel as if they're in the differentiation stage. They feel differently toward the person they're involved with romantically. Ironically, sometimes people slip into the differentiation stage simply because of neglect. They become so comfortable with their beloved that they get sloppy, and they just allow themselves to slip into the differentiation stage. Other times, people intentionally move themselves into the differentiation stage. They ruminate or they dwell on what's going on with those differences, and that keeps them in the differentiation stage. So communicatively, what's going on in the differentiation stage? Well, first of all, there tends to be less tolerance of previously accepted behaviors. You might recall that when we talked about the integration stages of romantic relationships, in the experimentation stage, there was an endurance of negative behaviors. Now, in the differentiation stage, you begin to tolerate them less. So, for example, Romeo used to find it quite endearing that Juliet would laugh sometimes and snort like a pig when she did so. But now Romeo becomes more annoyed by that habit, and it bothers him, and he tends to make a critical comment to Juliet about that. Oftentimes there's an increase in the frequency and the intensity of conflict that couples experience. That intensity of conflict oftentimes leaves one or both people dissatisfied with the end of a conflict episode. That is what we called previously in the course a type 1 conflict resolution. Obviously, when these things are going on, there's a greater tension or awkwardness between the people involved in the romantic relationship. And this, in turn, leads to a decrease in the amount of exclusive time spent together. It's not as if people never spend time together. In fact, one of the markers of the differentiation stage is that from the outside, everything in the relationship can look fine. It's just that on the inside, in particular in the head of the person who's in this differentiation stage, things are very much feeling different. Communicatively, also in this differentiation stage, there tends to be a reduction to the other person's needs. So, for example, if Romeo used to always open the car door for Juliet, this symbolic gesture is not done as often. Or it might be that Romeo doesn't make Juliet the cup of coffee in the morning that he used to make for her upon her waking up each day. The communication between the two of them also begins to degrade. The talk centers on more of things outside the relationship. They have fewer relational talks. When they talk about the relationship, it's almost always an argument of some kind, or it's some kind of a negative, critical type of thing. It's less forward-thinking, less hopeful, and less optimistic. All of these things together begin to create relational problems. And Julia Wood, a researcher at the University of North Carolina, whom we met earlier, has done research on the problems couples experience in this differentiation stage. And she finds an important difference between males and females. Typically, in the differentiation stage, females believe the best way to address whatever problems occur is by talking about them, by addressing them. So the idea is that talk becomes the elixir. It becomes the way to solve the problem. This makes sense because we said that earlier, Deborah Tainen's research believes that females tend to see the world through a connective lens. And with that connective lens, talk becomes a way to bring people together. So if differentiation tends to move people apart, the talk could be a way to solve the problem and bring people together. From the male perspective, on the other hand, it's not the talk that tends to solve things. In the male perspective, whenever there are problems in the differentiation stage, males are more likely to adopt an attitude that things will fix themselves. They'll just let it ride and see what happens. So for males, rather than a proactive approach, there tends to be this passive approach, which assumes that problems will work themselves out over time. This fundamental difference in the way to solve problems obviously can create differences between males and females with respect to how they respond to the differentiation stage. So if a male enters the differentiation stage, it tends to be more difficult on the couple than if the female enters the differentiation stage. Now, knowing nothing more than what I've just shared about Wood's research, if you're male, you need to recognize that more relational talk might be an indication that your beloved is in the differentiation stage. On the other hand, if you're female, knowing about this research should tip you off to the fact that if your boyfriend or husband is in the differentiation stage and you sense that, he might not want to talk about it or want to fix it. And obviously, these two fundamental differences lead to all sorts of possible conflict with respect to doing what it takes to remove oneself from the differentiation stage. Now, as I said, the differentiation stage is not necessarily detrimental. It can be if you spend significant periods of time in it, or if you're doing things that harm the relationship's underlying culture. But it's quite common for people to slip into and out of the differentiation stage. However, some couples move on to the next stage. And so the second stage in this disintegration process is what Mark Knapp calls circumscribing. Circumscribing is not a word that we typically use, but here Knapp uses it to refer to a significant change in the patterns of communication. To circumscribe something is to go around something, and that's exactly what's happening here in this second stage. Unlike the differentiation stage, the second circumscribing stage is the most important stage in the dissolution of a romantic relationship. Here's why. The differentiation stage is the kind of stage that people do come into and out of, but what's going on in that stage is, in the grand scheme of things, not necessarily that significant. But what happens in the circumscribing stage is significant, because what's going on in the circumscribing stage tends to really do bad damage to the underlying fabric of a romantic relationship. On top of that, people will spend a long amount of time in the circumscribing stage. Typically, when people slip into the differentiation stage, it's only a matter of days or weeks, but people can spend years in the circumscribing stage. Now, more commonly, people will spend months in the circumscribing stage, but it can last a long time. And because this stage lasts longer, and because what's going on communicatively tends to be more detrimental, the circumscribing stage becomes more important. On top of that, what we find is most people make the decision to terminate a romantic relationship in the second circumscribing stage. People tend not to decide to leave their spouse in the differentiation stage. People don't choose to break up with their girlfriend in the differentiation stage. But in the circumscribing stage, in particular the longer that stage lasts, that's when people are making the decision to break up. Now, they don't actually do the breaking up until we get to the fourth termination stage. We'll talk about that in the next video. But for now, just understand that the circumscribing stage really is the pivotal stage that determines whether a couple stays together or whether they break up. So, what's going on in the circumscribing stage? Well, communicatively, there is a decreased quality and quantity of communication. Romeo and Juliet simply talk less than they used to. And when Romeo and Juliet talk, it's a shallow, stunted, difficult kind of communication. Now, not always, but it's just that that becomes more common. It becomes more woven into the fabric of their communicative patterns of interaction. When they have these conversations, there's less self-disclosure, less openness and vulnerability than there used to be. In fact, to listen to Romeo and Juliet talk at the dinner table, it almost sounds like they're two roommates rather than two lovers. And so this quality of communication begins to decline. In turn, what happens is there's an appearance of deception. Now, you can deceive the person you love or the person you're involved with romantically at any point in your relationship. Yet research finds that people are more likely to be deceptive here in the circumscribing stage than any other. It's also no surprise that in the circumscribing stage, people are more likely to begin to look around for replacements to the person that you're currently involved with. Now, that might not be an active looking around. It could be in the back of your mind looking around. But because of that, that can contribute to this appearance of deception. Moreover, the appearance of deception indicates a declined respect for the person you're involved with. So if Romeo begins to not tell the entire truth to Juliet about who he's spent time with or what he's been doing, it might be that he also is beginning to disrespect Juliet to a greater level. Romeo also begins to offer more frequent and more critical evaluative statements. Evaluative statements can be sarcasm or snarky comments, snide comments, out-and-out criticism, anything that's evaluating the behavior of someone else. Now, it used to be that Romeo didn't do this very much to Juliet, but because Romeo has begun to slip into the circumscribing stage, he begins to criticize little things that Juliet does. He criticizes the way she loads the dishwasher. He criticizes the way she talks to the kids. He criticizes the fact that she can't seem to put her makeup on correctly. Now, Romeo never used to do this. Maybe he thought these things in his head, but he didn't verbalize them. But now he's doing both. And this, in turn, tends to lead to that intensity of conflict that becomes even more significant than it was in the differentiation stage. It should be no surprise, then, that Romeo begins to turn to other people as the chief source of emotional support. Now, emotional support is an important component of any romantic relationship. It's this idea that there's someone we can turn to talk with about our problems. As we said in the gender communication section of the course, it's the person with whom we do troubles talk. Well, in this romantic relationship, when things are good, it was Juliet that Romeo turned to talk about this. But now that Romeo is in the circumscribing stage, he begins to turn to people outside the relationship. And in particular, he begins to turn to a female that he happens to work with. And so he vents to this female with whom he works about his relationship with Juliet. And in fact, he ends up talking with this female more often about his relationship than he does with Juliet. So the relational talk, in a sense, is exported to someone else. That is very dangerous. And in the research, this tends to correlate with a greater risk of infidelity, in particular in marriages. But beyond that, what we find is the sharing of this information with someone on the outside often provides a perspective. And that perspective often affirms how people feel. And so ironically, when Romeo is in the circumscribing stage and begins to talk to people outside the relationship about the problems in the relationship, that talk tends to reaffirm his perspective. It tends to reaffirm his view of things, which only serves to further entrench his view and dig him even deeper into this circumscribing stage. Because all this is going on in Romeo's head, there's a decrease in the direct expressions of commitment. He doesn't tell Juliet he loves her as often as he used to. The things that used to symbolize their commitment, like, for example, praying together each night before they went to bed, that begins to diminish. In addition, defensiveness tends to be on the rise in the circumscribing stage. Romeo gets more defensive when he speaks with Juliet. Now, this is mitigated in part by people's personality. If you're not naturally a defensive person, you're not likely to become a really big defensive person here in the circumscribing stage. But that said, even people who typically are not very defensive, their level of defensiveness tends to rise in this stage. On the other hand, for those people whose personality tends to be very defensive on a regular basis, they tend to get really defensive in this circumscribing stage. When Romeo talks about his relationship with Juliet to other people, he tends to talk about it in a negative light rather than a positive one. In fact, the picture that Romeo paints of his relationship with Juliet when he speaks with his friends is not a very flattering one. He talks badly about Juliet. He might complain and whine about his relationship with Juliet. And so rather than talking about the importance and benefits of his relationship, instead, when talking with other people outside the relationship, he never speaks of the relationship's importance and he never talks about it favorably. Now, for people outside the relationship, when they see Romeo moving his support to other people, when they see Romeo talking badly about the relationship, that for them should be an indication that something's not right with he and Juliet. In particular, if that's a change in the way Romeo used to talk about the relationship. And so for people outside the relationship, this becomes a very good indicator that in fact something is not right. Furthermore, in the circumscribing stage, Romeo begins to pay less attention to the rules and the culture of the relationship. Each romantic relationship develops its own sense of rules, its own relational culture, but those rules have to be adhered to. So, for example, as Romeo and Juliet began their relationship, it was evident that their families clashed with one another. The Capulets and the Montagues just didn't get along. But when Romeo and Juliet began to date, they vowed to overcome that. Here's the problem. In the relationship, they developed a kind of rule that said no talking bad about one another's family. Now, Romeo, in the circumscribing stage, begins to violate that. He begins to complain to Juliet about her family. He begins to tell Juliet things about her family that are not complimentary. And in fact, from here on out, this begins to lead to conflict and tension between Romeo and Juliet. On top of that, part of their culture was that Romeo would bring Juliet a cup of coffee each morning. Now, not only is he not doing that, he's also speaking negatively about Juliet when she questions him about why he's no longer doing that. Another thing communicatively that's going on is that people begin to take on different roles in the relationship. So, for example, it was previously that Romeo was Juliet's biggest supporter. His role to her was in part to be an encourager. He was the one that was always trying to build up her confidence. He was the one trying to boost her self-esteem. He would always tell her that she can do it. He was trying to empower her with words of affirmation and with other kinds of encouragement. But now that he's in the circumscribing stage, Romeo begins to take on a new role towards Juliet. It's a more antagonistic role. And so he moves from being a supporter role to being a critic role. We said earlier that oftentimes there's an increase in the evaluation statements that are made. If someone is shifting from a supporter role to a critic role, there's many, many more evaluative statements made. And so now Romeo is often criticizing Juliet. Now he might frame that as doing something for her own good. So for example, if Juliet becomes more forgetful, it might be that Romeo takes on this antagonistic role by starting to chastise her for her forgetfulness. He might tease her, he might not criticize her. But whatever's happening, he's less supportive, less encouraging, and therefore playing a different role in his relationship with Juliet. All of these things that are going on in the circumscribing stage begin to mount, and these are the kinds of things that start to tear at the fabric of the relationship. This is one of the reasons why the circumscribing stage is so difficult. In Romeo's head, there comes to be this general sentiment that he's unwilling to do what's necessary to save the relationship. And so he begins to make some conscious choices about what he does or does not do in this particular stage. And that's one thing that separates the circumscribing stage from the differentiation stage. People are far more likely to make conscientious choices to do things or to stay in the circumscribing stage as compared to the differentiation stage. People will slip into the differentiation stage, but people rarely slip into the circumscribing stage. People tend to choose to move into the circumscribing stage. Now that's one reason why, when we talked about Julia Wood's research, about how females tend to want to talk about problems and males tend to want to just let them ride, this is why the female approach oftentimes is more effective at having the circumscribing stage be shorter and therefore less detrimental to a romantic relationship. Because the research is clear. The longer people spend in the circumscribing stage, the more detrimental it is to the relationship. And the longer people spend in the circumscribing stage, the less likely it is the relationship can recover from that and end up being repaired and put back on firm ground. In fact, the longer people spend in the circumscribing stage, the more likely it is that the relationship will ultimately be terminated. And so for all of these reasons, the circumscribing stage becomes the key stage in the dissolution of romantic relationships. So the question then becomes, if a couple falls into or moves into the circumscribing stage, does that mean they are doomed? Well, the answer to that is no, not necessarily. If only one of the two partners is in the circumscribing stage, that's better than if they both are. Now, if they're both in the circumscribing stage, then it's true that statistically speaking, the chances of the relationship recovering from that are not good. And that's why in the circumscribing stage, this is where most romantic couples will either need some kind of intervention or some kind of shock therapy in order to fix the relationship. So for example, in marriages, this is when couples go to counseling. Or in long-term dating relationships, this is when they've got to have some kind of big talk that tries to solve the problems. Because if they don't have some kind of a significant change in the way they interact, the chances are pretty good that a couple in the circumscribing stage is headed for termination. And so, in the big picture, The dissolution of romantic relationships takes place over 4 discernible stages. The first one we talked about, differentiation. The second one we talked about, circumscribing. In the next video, we'll tackle the final 2 stages in Mark Knapp's model of the dissolution of romantic relationships.